Live from WHO headquarters here in Geneva, Switzerland. My name is Nika Alexander. I'm one of the communications officers here at headquarters. And I'm here today with Dr. Janet Diaz. Hi, Janet. She's the head of clinical care in the WHO Emergencies Programme, and she's also the lead for clinical care around COVID. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Clinical care means patient care, but I'll ask Janet, Dr. Diaz, to explain that in more detail. So can you give us an idea of what you're working on within this emergency response?
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So my role in the emergency response is to lead the case management and the clinical care of patients affected with COVID-19. So that ranges with a lot of different types of work, but all are centered around the patient and the person who's affected with COVID-19. The primary role is to work on clinical guidance, so guidance that is available for clinicians, frontline clinicians that are caring for patients with COVID-19, and also educational materials that are used for clinicians caring for patients with COVID-19, and also looking at the operational structural issues around the care of patients with COVID-19. What kind of facilities are they being cared for? Is there sufficient equipment to care for these patients? So that is some of the scope. In addition, working on research. So how can we advance the care of COVID-19 and looking at innovation? How can innovation also improve the care of patients with COVID-19?
So that's a lot that you're working on, that our colleagues are working on across the world, in fact. So we'll unpack that a little bit just to get a better understanding, and we'll take questions from you as well, as it is Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter Live after all. You're not yourself caring for patients, Dr. Diaz, but you are working with people who are directly caring for patients with COVID. So tell me a little bit about how you learn from their experience and how we gather that information and share it with other doctors and healthcare workers around the world so they know how to care for patients with COVID, which after all is a new disease. So tell me a little bit about how you interact with those frontline workers and learn from them.
Gosh, well, that's a good question. Since the beginning of this outbreak, we have convened clinicians from all over the world through a knowledge exchange platform, which is what we call it. And it's a bi-weekly meeting where we initiated this network of clinicians to join us and share their experiences. So it's actually a peer-to-peer knowledge exchange platform. And that is how we started to coordinate globally the discussion about what it's like caring for patients with COVID-19, especially at the beginning when there was very little information known. So we relied heavily on these open discussions, sharing experiences, and that was what contributed to us understanding how to write our guidelines for care of patients with COVID-19. At the same time, or as time went on, then clinicians start to write publications in journals, and so then we start to integrate those publications and that evidence that's being compiled and shared and that we're looking at critically, and that also informs us on how to best care for patients with COVID-19.
When you talk about these networks that you're involved in, these are phone calls, Zoom calls, I mean, just literally that, right?
These are Zoom calls. Zoom has become very popular, but also other interfaces in order to just gather a lot of people. And our approach has really been one of open exchange of information, really learning from each other and integrating that into advancing our guidance documents.
I think it's really interesting what you said about how it's changed. So in the beginning, it was just raw data. You were just learning from the doctors, the people who were caring for patients, the nurses, just learning about what was happening. And then over time, perhaps in some countries, as their first wave of the outbreak has subsided, they've had time to gather their knowledge together and issue it in scientific papers. And then we put that together and have more evidence behind what we're recommending, right? So it's almost like a phase. In the beginning, you have to grab what you can, and then over time you're able to put more of a foundation under what we're saying and recommending. Mm-hmm. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll get back to the guidance we've just updated recently, but I'm just checking on my phone. This is where your questions will come to me. On Facebook and LinkedIn, you can write your question via the comment section, and on Twitter, use the hashtag Ask WHO. Those of you who followed these conversations before are familiar with that process, but that's how we ask you to do it. So comments in Facebook and LinkedIn, and hashtag Ask WHO if you have any questions for Dr. Diaz. So you mentioned our guidance, and that's what you were talking about, what we put together. It's guidance, so governments, and then hospitals, and then the healthcare workers themselves actually get a printed document or on the web guidance on how to care for a patient who is sick with COVID. Those were updated, those were issued in the beginning. There was a quick set that was issued, and they were updated again just last week. Can you tell us a little bit, sort of broadly what's in them, and then we'll go into a bit of detail.
Thanks. So this, so like you said, a guidance document is made for the target audience. So in this case, it's made for member states, and specifically this clinical guidance is made for clinicians. So those are health workers that are caring for patients with COVID-19. And the way we've developed our guidance was really to be something practical for frontline clinicians. That means from taking care of patients from the beginning of their illness to the end of their illness, and going through the different phases, potential phases of their illness. We do know most patients have mild disease, and that hasn't changed. But we do know also some patients develop severe disease and critical illness. So the guidance goes through the different phases of illness, different severities of illness that patients may experience.
You're saying that hasn't changed. I would imagine you mean since we first learned about this disease and since doctors in China were first caring for patients. There was that proportion we know of that about 80% of people seem to not have as severe disease. Maybe half of those almost feel nothing, half of those may even have pneumonia. And then there's that percentage of people who actually have to go into the hospital for care, and that's what this guidance would be about.
What we've done for this last guidance is a couple of, maybe two important things. One is there has been a lot of publications in scientific journals that have been looking at complications associated with COVID, looking at different explaining better the disease. And so we were able to take in some of those details into this guidance in order to address some of those clinical manifestations or what patients may be experiencing. In order to address that better in this guidance. And the second important thing about this guidance is we actually convened a guideline development group, which is an expert panel of clinical experts from around the world to help advise us on how to improve this guidance and make it more, user-friendly for the frontline worker. I know that
WHO also has processes for developing guidance. There's a rapid guidance development process, which is speedy, and there's certain rules that we have to follow when we do that. And then there's other guidance that's true WHO guidance that follows a different process. So there's sort of different grades of guidance as well. We have a question on, you touched on recovery. We have a question on that. From Facebook, Dennis Sila Ciengo asked, how long does it normally take for someone to recover from COVID? And right in there's the question normally, because I know would be a range, but what is it in general?
So it depends on how sick you got with COVID. So patients may have mild disease where they have minimal symptoms, but they may have mild symptoms for maybe 7 days, 10 days, 15 days. And then we also know some patients develop more severe critical disease, and patients can be in intensive care for up to 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or even longer. And then until resolution of symptoms, we still need to see more about that. We need to do more studies to look at patients after their hospitalization, after their intensive care stay, and see how long do symptoms continue, or how long does it take to recovery. Sometimes it's not just from the COVID-19 itself. The COVID-19, the virus may have caused you to have severe pneumonia or require a tube and a mechanical ventilator. But during that time, your body does get weak from being that sick. So the recovery period is not just from the virus itself, it's actually from being so sick with critical illness, from being in bed for 3 weeks. And that is a recovery period that we still need to work out and understand better.
And some of that needing to work out and understand better is because we're so early, and this is a new disease and we're in the first few months of it. We've just hit the 6-month mark since the beginning, since this virus is identified. And so we're still learning because there still haven't been that many people who have gotten sick and recovered enough to be followed to know what happens after 3, 4, 5 months, because there's very few people who are now 3, 4, 5 months after the disease, if you know what I'm saying. It's just we're still learning from the people who are going through this illness now and coming through the other side, and that's how we'll learn more and more what the long-term effects are. A question about healthcare workers. From Facebook, how can healthcare workers protect themselves when they are caring for COVID-19 patients? So I know your guidance is about clinical care. There's other guidance about infection prevention and control specifically for healthcare workers, but can you just give us the broad strokes about what healthcare workers can do to protect themselves?
So I think the most important thing is that if you suspect you could be caring for someone with COVID-19, then you must apply the right infection prevention and control measures. And what does that really mean? It means first you protect yourself by putting on the right PPE. And we know for COVID-19, our recommendations are to use droplet and contact precautions during usual care. And that means wearing a medical mask, wearing gloves, wearing a gown, wearing eye protection when you get close to the patient with COVID-19. And for those of you that are working in intensive care or emergency care, if you're going to do a procedure that's an aerosol generating procedure, that means like an intubation where you're going to put someone on a breathing machine, then we recommend also wearing a particulate respirator. So knowing the recommendations for IPC, what PPE to wear and how to put it on and take it off is quite important to protect yourself.
So that was in broad strokes, but there's actual specific guidance on infection prevention and control for healthcare workers in COVID as well, and it's very detailed. Dr. Diaz just touched on some of it, but it's very detailed as to what circumstances to wear, what kind of protection, and it varies as well depending on what part of the healthcare system you're in. So if you need to know more on that, please look on our website. I might just do a little plug for our website. We've recently made the guidance easier to find. That's responding to people saying that they know we have a lot of guidance there, but it's not always easy to access. So if you go to who.int, you click on the red box that's about COVID, and then you'll get to the page with all the information around COVID, and there's much more searchable information now. A lot of that information is for specialized workers, like Dr. Diaz was saying, for clinicians, or for healthcare workers, or for policymakers, or for people running camps where refugees live. So there's a really very specific, and then there's also some information more for the general public that will answer more general questions. So have a look on those pages, and hopefully you'll find what you're looking for. And if you're not, let us know, and we'll try to get back to you with the information you need. I just want to sidestep for a second now, because you work in the Emergencies Programme, and right now the main focus is on COVID, but at the same time we're also continuing to work on other emergencies globally, and one of the ones that has just emerged is an Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I say it's new because there was an outbreak in the eastern part of the country, and just as of last week we've identified a new one in the western part of the country in an area that had an Ebola outbreak 2 years ago and now seems to have another one. And I know you're working on that at the same time as you're working on COVID. So what are you doing now to ensure that the people who may be getting sick with Ebola in Bandaka, which is in the western part of DRC, are also going to get the care they need? At the moment, it's a small outbreak, but you never take an Ebola outbreak lightly. So we already are concentrating a lot of efforts on that outbreak. So can you tell us just a little bit more about, what you've been doing the last couple of days around that outbreak?
Thanks for the question. Well, in DRC, we spent quite a bit of time there with the national, workforce, with the Ministry of Health, with the National Research Institute over the past couple of years, working to improve the care of Ebola. And I hope that everyone knows that we did find a therapeutic in the outbreak in North Kivu that is effective at reducing mortality, saving lives from Ebola. So, and we also improved the standard of care, optimized supportive care with Ebola for Ebola patients during that outbreak. And we did this, hand side by side, the national teams, the national workers, and various partner agencies that have been working in DRC for a long time. So together, I do think we improve the care for Ebola. And so now in Bandaka, it may be, a different part of the country, but that national capacity exists. And so for us right now is really leveraging on what we have done in the past and supporting the national team and the Ministry of Health to care for patients. And they have access to therapeutics, they have access to rapid diagnostic testing, they have access to optimized supportive care and how to set up an Ebola treatment unit. And all that was done, I think, we put a lot of effort in that over the past couple of years, and I expect that we will see activate and be able for our colleagues in DRC to manage patients and stop the outbreak quickly.
Thank you. So that was a sidebar on Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So coming back to COVID now, we have a question from LinkedIn. Is there any guide for people who are taking care of sick patients at home? I know there is. I know that's not a main focus for you, but what can we tell people if there is somebody at home who's not sick enough to need to go to the hospital, but who still needs some kind of care?
So that is, we have a published guidance as you described. It's home care of patients with COVID-19. And I think there's three things that are important. One is to if you're the caregiver at home, so if there's someone sick at home and someone is providing care to that person, then to ensure that you're also using the right IPC measures to prevent yourself from getting sick. The second thing is for the patient that's suffering from COVID, that they stay well hydrated, that they're eating, and most importantly that that if they have any symptom that they're getting worse, that the cough is getting worse, or that the breathing is getting difficult, or that the eating, you're not taking in as much food as you should be, or you're getting, the mental status is changing, something as if like they're starting to develop a complication of COVID, then that triggers an early call to the COVID hotline, of whatever your country has in place as the service for COVID patients, so that you can immediately seek medical care. So although most patients, like we said, will have mild disease and not require any hospital care necessarily, if you are being cared at home and you do develop a complication, then we don't want to delay the access to rapid medical care.
And similarly, if the person is developing symptoms of other diseases, you also need to seek care. So it's not because there's COVID that people must stay home. You still must access the health services for other diseases as well as needed. You mentioned that people should, if you're caring for someone sick at home, that you should practice the right infection prevention and control measures. From reading those guidance previously, I remember that means that you should wear a medical mask. You, as the caregiver, should wear a medical mask, and the patient you're caring for should wear a medical mask when you are interacting. And there's a lot of hand washing and surface cleaning involved as well, as I recall. Is there anything else you would add around those measures that the caregiver or the patient should take at home?
I think you highlighted the most
the broad ones. All right. So just to remind people again, on Facebook and LinkedIn, if you have questions, write them in the comment section. And on Twitter, use the hashtag AskWHO. So we have another question here. We have several questions. Let me scroll down. So this one is a Facebook question. Iman Abdel Latif asks, what is the best protocol for COVID-19 treatment? I think that might be, can you explain a little bit what the course of treatment is for somebody who is in hospital, so not part of the approximately 80% of people who may not need to ever go to the hospital, but for those who are in hospital, if I become a patient tomorrow, what might I expect in my care?
Okay, so the treatment package, I guess the care package in the hospital, one is that usually if you're being hospitalized for having a pneumonia, then, which is a common reason COVID-19 patients may be hospitalized, what we try to ensure first is that we're monitoring you well, that we're checking your oxygen saturation by a little device we put on the finger, that we're checking your vital signs. And if your oxygen saturation starts to go low, that we treat you with oxygen. So oxygen is probably the first intervention that's life-saving for patients with COVID-19 who have developed severe pneumonia. And so that's one of the first interventions to expect. The second intervention to to expect is whether or not there's any possibility that you may have a co-infection. So for example, if you're living in an area where there may be malaria, then you would be tested for another disease. If you have a fever, then you would also be tested for that and possibly be treated for that. If there's any suspicion that you can have a co-infection with a bacterial pathogen infection, then you could potentially be given antibiotics, especially if you were severe in the hospital, not as an outpatient, but in the hospital. In addition, the questions become, do we have any antivirals that are effective for COVID-19? And that, is still, we still don't have one. So although there has been a tremendous amount of off-label use of various different antivirals for COVID-19, none of them to date has been shown to be effective.
So basically there's no drug that cures COVID-19 at the moment, but we're trying to find if there is.
Yeah, and so that's why it's a rapidly moving field. There is many excellent investigators doing high-quality clinical trials, including the WHO that's sponsoring the Solidarity trial around the world, recruiting patients and testing in a randomized fashion different therapeutic agents against each other and against standard of care or no therapeutic to find the answer. And that's the best way. That's the best way to find real evidence of safety and efficacy of an intervention. And so, as these studies begin to publish, what WHO, many of us, are doing is looking at the results of these studies, sometimes putting different studies together to see if the bigger numbers gives us a signal. And as soon as we see a signal, then we would consider changing our recommendations. So we're going to call those rapid recommendations. And that's the process we anticipate will happen over time now. But if it looks like one of these agents is going to be shown to be effective. But at this moment in time, we do not recommend these antivirals outside of a clinical trial or a monitored emergency use mechanism.
For those of you who are interested in the Solidarity trial, there's information on the website. As Dr. Diaz explained, one of the things that the trial does is it brings together what people are learning in many different countries and can consolidate it, and we can learn more from it that way. And we can do one of these about the trial or do an update for you if you're interested. There's also a press conference we hold at 5 p.m. on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays with our Director General, with the head of our Emergencies Programme, Dr. Mike Ryan, and the head of the technical side of this response, Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove. And that's open to the public. You may have watched it already. It's interpreted into all UN languages and a few extra languages as well. So feel free to watch there. That's a good way of getting an update on what we're working on at the moment. You mentioned that there is no drug that's effective against COVID-19. And the trial that we are helping to run is looking at 5 different drugs, but people often hear about hydroxychloroquine, and it is and isn't it effective, and is and isn't dangerous. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know so far, or what we're trying to discover about hydroxychloroquine?
I think like the other therapeutics, hydroxychloroquine being one, but others that are under investigation, they're all being investigated. We do not know their true efficacy and safety profile. So like I said before, the best way to understand this is through a randomized controlled trial. There is, some observational data that's being published, but again, in order to really assess efficacy and safety, the best way to do that is through randomized controlled trials.
Thank you. You also mentioned antibiotics, and you explained that, and I just want to repeat it because I know there can be some confusion. People think, can I use antibiotics to fight COVID? COVID's a virus, antibiotics fight bacteria, but you did mention if a person has COVID and something else at the same time, their healthcare professional might decide they need to be treated with the antibiotic to get rid of that other infection.
So this is important comment. So I think the first thing is just to be very clear, antibiotics do not treat COVID-19. They do not treat virus infection. So that's one. For mild disease, there's really no indication for antibiotics either as prophylaxis or as treatment. And it only becomes more, there's a possibility when you're in hospital and when you come in with and if you're diagnosed with severe pneumonia, sometimes that COVID-19 test may not come right back right away, right? You may be waiting a little bit of time before you get the result. The doctor's waiting. So until they confirm it with a laboratory test, they may give you in the hospital antibiotics for potential bacterial pneumonia. So this is not to confuse anything. But once they get that COVID-19 test back to confirm the test, then they will likely stop the antibiotics and attribute the pneumonia just to COVID-19. And again, as settings, depending on where you live, you know, if you're living in a place where there's co-infection with malaria, we don't know a lot about if you get malaria and COVID-19. So we do recommend if you have a fever in those areas that you go along the malaria testing and treatment pathways per national protocols. Same thing goes, you know, with influenza. Let's say influenza season starts and influenza circulating. We don't know yet enough about what will happen. You know, can you get influenza and COVID-19? So if that's the situation, then we will recommend if influenza is circulating, that you go along the influenza diagnostic testing and treatment pathways in that country as well.
Did the healthcare worker do that?
Yeah.
So there's a few questions. I'm going to consolidate it into one, and it's related to treatment a little bit as well. Questions around traditional or herbal medicine. So are there any traditional approaches, traditional treatments that are shown to be effective against COVID?
I think it's another excellent question, and we don't know. So we don't have currently the evidence, and when we say evidence, we're meaning kind of, again, like I was saying before, a little bit of evidence from randomized controlled trials that are showing efficacy and safety of an intervention, be it an herbal medicine. So again, we do ask that if people are going to try these unproven therapies, whatever class of therapy that they are, that they do so under you know, clinical trial, controlled trial protocols where you gather, when that means that you have ethical approval, which means the government approves, the ethics committees in the country approve, and you collect data on the patients, right? Both on the treatments and on the side effects, and so that the data can be analyzed to better understand what this intervention may or may not be doing.
And the solidarity trial that WHO is running, or the choices that were made for that trial were based on therapeutics that had some kind of promise already. So you were looking at something that already had some kind of evidence of some kind of potential. But as I say, we could do something separate on that. I just wanted to let you guys know where people are watching from. We've got Brazil, Mali, India, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Portugal, Palestine, Cambodia, Kenya, Ethiopia, US, Pakistan, Tanzania, Netherlands, Ghana, Algeria, Senegal, Myanmar, Iran, South Africa, Botswana, I'm almost finished, Benin, Egypt, Tunisia, and UK. So thank you so much for tuning in as well. We're going to wrap up soon, so if you have a question, please let us know right away. Put it in the comments on Facebook and LinkedIn, or use hashtag AskWHO if you're on Twitter. You mentioned briefly oxygen and how important oxygen is in the care for people with COVID. We talk a lot about the need for ventilators, but before people are so sick that they need ventilators, one of the ways we can prevent them from getting that sick, or one of the interventions that's helpful, is giving them oxygen, which helps them breathe, I guess. Can you tell us a little bit more about how important the use of oxygen is in clinical care for patients with COVID?
So oxygen, just to be clear, oxygen is an essential medicine on the WHO essential medication list, and that's an important thing, which means that we do think it's life-saving. And that includes not just for COVID-related pneumonia, but also for other causes of severe pneumonia. Severe pneumonia continues to be one of the leading causes of death in children under 5 years old globally, less than 5 years of age globally. So pneumonia is something that we are concerned about. Now, COVID-19, when you develop a complication of COVID-19 like severe pneumonia, then one of the primary therapies is oxygen. And so why is oxygen important? Oxygen, your body's organs need oxygen. Oxygen is necessary for the organs to function normally. And if you don't have that in the organs and the cells in the body don't get enough oxygen, that can cause dysfunction of the cells and eventually cell death. So oxygen is an important component.
And ventilators aren't easy for some countries, they don't have a lot of ventilators, and many other countries don't even have access to oxygen. Can you tell us, just as we're almost wrapping up, what WHO is doing to help countries get better access to oxygen?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges in some resource settings where there is limited access to oxygen is that you don't have proper oxygen systems. So oxygen systems means that you can deliver lots of oxygen to many patients at a time. In some countries, or some settings in some countries, may not have sufficient oxygen systems. So we know that, and so what we're trying to do is accelerate access to oxygen. The first priority in doing that through our global supply chain system was to get oxygen concentrators, which are these portable, small devices that can actually provide oxygen to 1 or 2 patients, depending on how much flow they generate. And that's kind of a rapid way to introduce oxygen. It does require electricity, a stable source of electricity, but it's a rapid way to provide oxygen. A more sustainable way to provide larger scales of oxygen is through something called a PSA plant, which is a plant that actually, like in a typical hospital with oxygen, is how they make their oxygen. And that gets piped into the rooms of the hospital. So we're also working to see how we can scale up these types of more sustainable, larger production oxygen plants at the country level where they are needed. Ventilators are also life-saving if you develop critical illness or respiratory failure where the oxygen is insufficient. We have about now, there's a couple different types of ventilators, but at large, they usually require a good amount of oxygen and a good amount of pressurized air. And so if you're thinking about a setting which may have limited oxygen, putting a ventilator in without having enough oxygen won't work. So you must focus first to increase your oxygen capacity, because that will be required to run the ventilator, because the ventilator is a way to give oxygen and pressure. And so there's some details there that are very important to understand. So for us, the focus has been augment oxygen as quickly as possible, because that will save the most lives, and then introduce the right ventilator type of device, which there's many details about that I won't go into right now, that are important to get the right device to the right place in order so that it functions well for the clinician and the patient.
Thank you. So they go hand in hand, really, the
Yeah.
oxygen and ventilators. From the notes I have, we've allocated or distributed those oxygen concentrators you were talking to 41 countries. I think we're going to wrap up now, actually. Is there anything you wanted to add? Anything you wanted to point people towards? Any other materials on our website? Or shall we just wrap up?
I think for those of you that are frontline clinicians that may be on this, please access the guidelines that were posted at the end of last week on our website. There's also educational materials that we're updating, and hopefully by the end of next week on openwho.org and on the Academy, they will reflect all the new guidance. And we're also working on some videos as well, for really basic videos for frontline providers that will focus on oxygen and ventilators and those things. So this is, as everyone knows, we're all in this together. I think what WHO is trying to do here, is to do the best for the public health, to provide materials and guidance that's usable, trustworthy, and other dissemination materials and education materials that can be used on the front line. So we hope that these become useful to you.
And we've had this entire conversation in English, but a lot of the materials are translated into other languages as well, the training courses as well. So do go online, and at the upper right-hand side, you can see a box where you can switch languages, and that's a way where you can see if the material you're looking at is also available in the other official UN languages. So thank you very much, Dr. Diaz, for being with us today. Dr. Janet Diaz is the head of clinical care in the WHO Emergencies Programme. My name is Nika Alexander. I'm part of the communications team here at WHO. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for continuing to follow WHO, learn about COVID, and ask us your questions if we haven't answered it already today. Have a good day.